Today, is peer-to-peer the future of everything?
Lending, cars, storage. Did Airbnb really invent the future?
Then, the first pictures of a black hole. How did we get them?
I'm Alexa Scordato, and this is Future Forward.
I am Steven Rosenbaum. Let us launch. Hey, Alexa, how are you?
Hey, Steve. Happy Super Bowl Sunday.
Happy Groundhog Day.
Wait, it's Groundhog Day?
How do you not
Wait,
know that? It's Groundhog
I don't know.
Day.
Is it spring?
There was a shadow thing, but more importantly, it's an excuse to go and rewatch the Bill de Blasio Groundhog video, which I now watch annually every year. I know is wrong. I'm sorry, Bill, but it's just so damn funny. So we're going to get to chapter 2.5, which is going to be Glenn Zorbet joining us from IEEE Spectrum to talk about the very first pictures of a black hole. But we're not going to start there. We're going to start with this peer-to-peer thing.
I'm all about it. I was pumped.
Because, at first when we started looking at the show today, it looked like it was one of a bunch of, there was a story here, there's a peer-to-peer. And I was like, wait a minute. They all tie together.
All peer-to-peer. We're just sharing everything. It's a sharing economy.
So maybe for our listeners, just a brief primer on the early day. What was Airbnb the first?
I mean, I think Airbnb and Uber were basically around the same time. Like, oh, I'm gonna go sleep on someone's couch or spare bedroom, and I'm also gonna get in a car with a stranger.
See, I don't think of Uber in the same way. It's interesting.
Really?
But we'll get there. We'll get there. So let's start with this first. There's actually a news peg to this show. So let's start with about neighbor.
Yep.
Store stuff with your neighbor. So, we both live in the city. So, well, actually, I have a little extra space. I suppose I could have people store stuff. I hadn't thought of it now. Maybe I'll try Neighbor.
So without neighbor.com existing, I've done this. Whether it's my parents who live in Long Island nearby or friends who live in buildings where there's basement storage, I've definitely offloaded things like a Christmas tree stand or seasonal things.
So the idea is, instead of going to a storage company like, Manhattan Mini Storage and renting a boxy thing, you would put up on Neighbor, hey, I've got an extra room in my garage, and somebody else would say, I have some stuff I need to store with you, right? Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, and it's wild. I mean, I clearly don't have a surplus of space in my apartment, but say my double closet in the hallway, if I had space there, I mean, I could imagine someone down the hall, if they're oh, I have so many shoes and the dress shoes that I only wear for weddings, I'd love to just not have them take up space in my hallway. If I made, I don't know, $25 a month to have my neighbor keep their shoes in my closet, I'd probably be okay with that.
So, spirit of full disclosure, I used to use Manhattan Mini Storage. We shifted to a company called MakeSpace, which we're going to talk about on another show. What?
I use MakeSpace too.
Yeah. Well, I know those guys really well, and I really like what they're building. So
different show.
So here's what I don't get about Neighbor, but maybe some of it's general. First of all, immediately let me play pessimist for a moment. Insurance.
Okay.
You put your stuff with me and I, lose it or break it or steal it.
Mm-hmm.
And then creepiness, stranger comes to my house and puts foul smelling box in closet. And then months later I look inside and it's it's a head or a severed limb or something terrible.
So this episode is so timely because I actually spent 4 hours today going to open houses. And I looked at condos and co-ops in New York City, and there were basement storage areas for tenants. So there was one building, it had 16 units, and we walked through the storage area. And it literally is like any basement you would find, and people just had stuff down there. And so I was actually asking myself, how do I feel about this? And I guess when you live in a city and space feels like such a luxury, beggars can't be choosers.
So we're gonna zip back and forth in the peer-to-peer conversation because Airbnb obviously is the big granddaddy of all this. You could say the exact same thing about my pessimism. Wait, you're gonna take a room in your house and strangers are gonna show up that you don't know and sleep down the hall from you and eat out of your fridge. It seems, in the absence of their success, highly unlikely that it would succeed.
You feel that.
I
You feel,
do. I do. Um,
huh?
but they've gotten, I think, pretty good about building trust relationships between tenants and homeowners, and making sure how people had this person, there's all kinds of transparency on both sides, right?
So this is like where I get like really nerdy. Like I feel like I would go to grad school and study this because I'm like, how much of this is like the fact that like when I graduated college, all of these platforms were sort of coming around. And so the idea of like ownership was something that never really was like never part of my adulthood. Like I've always been sharing everything, sharing rooms, sharing bathrooms, sharing rides, sharing storage.
But I guess key to the whole peer-to-peer conversation, other than your relative youth and positive energy, is like, is there technology that's made the transparency in both directions safer and more acceptable than it would have been when my parents told me not to hitchhike because a stranger would pick you up?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, like the idea that people rate you as a host, the idea that you're even vetted as like a driver, the idea that there's like a mediator facilitating or and protecting both parties, that makes it so much easier.
I'm gonna skip the pessimism. This may be my last swing at pessimism. But neighbor, wouldn't that be the perfect way to store like illicit goods that you've gathered that you don't want in your house if the police come knocking?
Oh, sure, but like, isn't that, I mean, what about like safety deposit boxes that maybe have like stolen jewelry?
I was thinking like, anyway. All right, so
I guess I was like so gung ho.
that's
I don't
fine.
even know how to introduce
So,
pessimism into this
well,
conversation.
all right, so let's get to money though, because as opposed to physical space, which other than weirdness, probably you can get over. Like the next, well, here I have one more article that I pulled up, which is they call neighbor.com the Air BnB of storage, which I think
Hmm.
is amusing and funny. Let's get to peer lending, because that has some really interesting history to it, and some pretty fascinating results.
Okay, so where do you want to go back to the origins of it? Where do you
We
want to start?
how far back can you go?
I don't know. I You tell me. You start.
Well, no, because I mean I know a little bit about this micro lending. There's all kinds of, we didn't pull it up for today's conversation, but like you could go all the way back. I'm gonna forget his name, Muhammad Yunus, is that right?
Hmm.
Who's a famous and extraordinary kind of advocate of micro lending. Essentially, what I think people have found in the peer-to-peer lending space is when you lend small amounts of money to people that are going to put it to good use, one, the results are extraordinary. They pay it back like
Hmm.
there's virtually no scamming.
Yep.
Um, but I'm trying to remember if that's always in person. Maybe that's in person.
Yeah, I mean, I think my first exposure to this idea was probably through the lens of Kiva, which
Yep.
is a nonprofit. And it was idea that like you could start with a minimum of like an $1,100 loan to back a global entrepreneur who will then take that money and really do a lot with it in their local market. And I always thought that was really powerful.
So I should know this and I don't. In the micro lending space or the peer-to-peer lending space, is there like if you lend 10 people $100 and one of them loses it and the others over deliver, is there any kind of buffer so that you don't lose your one-on-one lending risk, or is there any kind of portfolio safety, or no?
I don't think so. I mean, I will admit I'm not the most fluent in this, and I would imagine there's a lot of context, like when you actually get into the details, the devil's in the details. But for me, peer-to-peer lending is powerful because it it like signifies that you don't have to turn to a uber wealthy private investor or a bank, right, to get money. That alone is a big deal, right? It makes funds more accessible and distributed, ideally, across the population. And then the second is that if you are an investor who say you have $50,000 in cash, liquid, and you want to do something with that, it means that you can feel empowered where you have new sources of investment that are potentially lower risk. Like if you wanted to, like, I don't know, like income share agreements. That's actually a different show. But like if you wanted to take someone who wanted to be a developer and say, I'm going to pay for your $15,000 boot camp, and if you're going to graduate with a $90,000 salary, like you can potentially do the math and say, I'm going to recoup that cost faster
Yeah.
than if I were to like invest in a stock.
All right, so let me read you just a paragraph from Motley Fool, which talks a little bit about peer-to-peer. And it's just a quote. It says, as an investor, you may have heard of this type of financing and wondered, what is peer-to-peer lending? Well, peer-to-peer lending, P2P, is known as social lending and crowd lending, and it gives individuals and businesses needing to borrow money direct access to funds from other individuals and investors. That allows them to bypass traditional financial institutions, which often have more stringent credit requirements, with easier access to financing that they need. Meanwhile, it provides those with funds to invest with potential earned higher results. So, I mean, I get that, and I guess the thing in all of these cases, and what we're starting to see as a pattern, is individuals, when they interact with other individuals, take that commitment seriously, and care about their reputation in that community, don't want to mishandle it, misuse it. And
Yep.
so it really comes down to kind of the human bond of trust.
Yeah, in some ways you can say that technology is a barometer of trust in this digital economy, that it serves as a broker and a barometer for lenders and borrowers.
So I'm going to tell a story, and then we'll get to the next chapter of this unraveling puzzle. So I had to take a trip a couple of weeks ago, and Zipcar was going to be expensive, and Avis was going to be expensive, and I ended up Googling around and ended up on Turo.
Hmm.
And Turo is a peer-to-peer automotive lending site, and someone was going to lend me I was going to rent from them their Tesla, and I've never driven a Tesla,
Hmm.
and it was weird because I was like, I'd never rent a Tesla, I don't think, but it was this guy Joe, and he was in Jersey City, and he wanted to rent me his Tesla.
So you
And
did it.
no, I didn't.
Oh, okay. Why
Um,
not?
I couldn't quite figure out how to get to him and pick it up and then communicate with him how to get it. Like it was going to be learning a new system. How do I get the keys? How do I drop off the keys? Like I couldn't quite manage the do a
So
new thing.
how do you feel about this hypothetical? We're friends. We've known each other for a long time. If I had a Tesla and you needed to borrow a car, how would you feel if I lent you the keys to my car?
Um, I would feel fine. I would,
Hmm.
but I would be anxious in a way that I wouldn't be with Avis, because
Interesting.
if it
Okay.
got scratched or I spilled a cup of coffee or anything happened to it, that whether it was me being sloppy or me just getting into an accident that someone lurched out in front of me, I would feel terrible about that.
Okay.
Not so much about Avis. Avis, I'd go, hey Avis, I banged up your car, and they
Hmm.
would say you owe us a lot of money, and I would say I have insurance, there'd be no emotion involved.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
but I think, but Turo is fascinating. Um, And it's funny, all of the articles that we pulled up, and we'll put the links in the show notes, all the articles are, it's dot dot dot, like Airbnb but for cars,
Yeah.
Airbnb but for, like, so clearly Airbnb figured something out, which is that if you could build a transparent two-way marketplace, people would interact with each other. I have this feeling that Turo is going to be kind of a massive success. Um, and by the way,
Why Turo specifically?
um, well, a couple of reasons. It's really dramatically cheaper, more reasonably priced than Avis. Zipcar is a shadow of its former self. It's been sold to Avis, and it's now essentially Avis, but not as good. Um, I think part of what Zipcar had in its early days was this sense of community. You were going to have a car, and then you were going to drop it off, and someone else was going to use it after you. So don't leave it dirty, and make sure it has gas in it. And there was actually some sense of camaraderie, even though you never met the other driver. But like I remember thinking, I could have just driven into the parking lot and handed the keys to the guy who was picking, and it could have been out of gas and been like, haha. But I never did that. I always felt like and I never got a dirty car, at least during the days when it was Zipcar before it got bought. So Turo, I think, has some of that same, neighbor / Airbnb. We're all connected. We want to be careful.
Yeah. I like the sentiment of it. I just wonder if they can actually compete with the big car services, because I am part of Enterprise's car sharing, and so it's interesting because it kind of works like Zipcar, where I just have access to windows of car time.
So tell me about how that works. Is it like, is the car sitting on the street somewhere and you have to use an app to find where it's parked?
It's like they're actually mostly in all of the car garages. Like there's one on 83rd Street between Amsterdam and Columbus.
Yeah, no, I know that garage really well. Do you find that the different subject, but do you find that the people in the garage, like someone did a deal at corporate and they're like, yeah, you're one of those people, or do they treat you nicely?
They treat me nicely. I mean, I feel like they're pulling cars in and out in the same way that they pull them for the residents who have monthly
Right.
parking there.
Right. So that works for you.
Yep.
All right. Well, that's good to know. But like, so
But
just,
it's still expensive. It's like super duper expensive.
yeah. All right. So let's zoom back a little bit. We only have a couple minutes left before we go to the black hole photo conversation. So so where do you come down on P2P as kind of the future of everything, which is probably the title of this pod?
I love it. I'm into it. I'm like an Airbnb power user. I, you know, get into lifts all the time. I would store my stuff in your basement if you listed it on neighbor.com. I would put my car on Turo. I don't know. I think if you have something that you can give and share with others, there's like real karma.
Nope.
And technology makes me feel safer and more secure in that transaction.
Okay. All right. Well, I do have some space, so maybe I will sign up for Neighbor. I don't know. Maybe I'll try it.
Try it. Yeah.
All right. So next up, earlier today, I had a talk with Glenn about the first black hole picture ever taken, and he, as you know, is among other things a space nerd, and he had some terrific insights. So we'll bring Glenn on and we'll chat about that for a moment. So Glenn, maybe this is a dumb question, but like when people see things that come from telescopes, like I think there's a temptation for novices to go, well, yeah, they just took a bunch of lenses and pointed it at the sky and it made a picture. Like, why is that technology? But of course, as you guys wrote in Spectrum, I guess this week, it's really complicated technology.
Right. So when you're talking about in this sort of technology, you have to think about, it helps to think about the different means of astronomical observation. So most people are familiar with the old classic optical telescope. So Mount Palomar in California is an example. You had this heyday of these optical instruments which had enormous optics. In many cases, they were reflectors, which mean they had a mirror. The mirror could be 100 inches or 200 inches or something, this main mirror in back, and it was a concave mirror, and the optics, it acted much the way a lens acts, gather light and focus it into other optics so that the eye could see, or more likely a photographic plate could record. I mean, there are still optical instruments like that, but astronomy has really, in the last so many decades, has really moved into an era of radio astronomy, where I think much of the most exciting observations are gathered with what are known as radio telescopes and not optical telescopes. And this image of the black hole is a great example of that.
So, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate, a novice here a little bit, but radio as opposed to optics means we're sending, like dumb it down for me. We're sending electronic beeps out, and we're getting beeps back, and we're turning that into pictures? No,
not exactly. So there's an electromagnetic spectrum, and it's electromagnetic waves, and it's an enormous source of information that we could tap to get information throughout the universe. So the electromagnetic spectrum ranges, it has different bands, and there's a very, very tiny sliver of it that we human beings can see with our eyes, and that's called visible light. But underneath it are radio waves and infrared radiation, and above it are ultraviolet, and it just keeps going. There's microwaves, microwaves that are like basically high radio waves, and then it keeps going. So the radio part of that is enormous. It's far larger than the visible part that we see with our eyes. So the possibility exists that you can take pieces of the radio wave, you can pick and choose them to suit what it is you want to see. So there's lots of things we can't see with visible radiation phenomenon out in the universe that we'd love to see and study. And we can do it with radio waves. And again, this is a perfect example of that, this imaging of a black hole, because it is now understood, or believed anyway, or strongly believed, that giant black holes exist at the center of virtually all galaxies in the universe, or most of them anyway. And we can't see these black holes because they're obscured. Well, there's a number of reasons why we can't see them or even really detect them. And one of them is that the centers of the galaxies are kind of swaddled in gas and dust, which prevents visible light from escaping from the center. I mean, the other issue here is that black holes don't emit light. In fact, they do the opposite. They suck light and everything else in. But they nevertheless may leave a radio imprint of their existence because they're constantly sucking in matter. So there's this matter that swirls around them. Some of it, of course, crashes in, a great deal of it. But that activity, the friction and magnetism of that activity creates what's called a plasma, which radiates in many frequencies, including visible and radio waves. And that radiation, we can't see much of it because it's, as I say, blocked by this dust and gas that's in galaxies and around this. But again, the radio spectrum is large. So by picking a specific tiny piece of that radio spectrum, you can find a piece where the information gets out. And
so what, from the standpoint of, like, as a space geek, like, where does this take us? Is this like, okay, we're all done, this is as good as it's going to get, or is this the beginning? I mean, the excitement around that image was palpable. I remember when it first was shown. Like, where are we on the journey?
It's really just the start of the journey.
That's what
because first of all, you might ask, well, why are you doing this? Why is this important to do? Well, one of the big things is that we can extend or better understand the theory of gravitation, which basically began in earnest with Einstein's calculations, his general relativity. So this was the start of a theory of gravitation, which is still going on now. And these kinds of extreme events and the activity surrounding a black hole, the plasma, the swirling mass, the magnetism, and all that, those create among the most extreme conditions in the universe that we know of. So these extreme conditions help scientists better understand gravity and fundamentally understand what gravity is. Like, what is gravity at the most fundamental level? These are the kinds of experiments that are going to shed tremendous new knowledge on that question. And the reason why this is just in early days yet is because these instruments that they use to make this image, as I mentioned, they used radio astronomy, not visible light, but radio astronomy. They used a frequency band that's seldom used in radio astronomy. Again, they had to pick this frequency band very carefully because it was pretty much the only little tiny piece of the electromagnetic spectrum where the information could go all the way from this galaxy, which is called Messier 87, all the way to Earth. And Messier 87 is 55 or 53 million light years away. So that's really far. If you could travel at the speed of light, it would still take you 54 million light years or so to get to Messier 87. So, fortunately, this piece of spectrum that they use to make these images is such that it can get all the way from the black hole at the center of Messier. It goes through that gas and dust, and it comes all the way to Earth, and it is slightly distorted by vapor and other phenomena in the Earth's atmosphere, but in a way that the team was able to compensate for. But the issue is that to get these images, they had to really push to the limits a technology called very long baseline interferometry, VLBI. This is a technique where you use radio telescopes widely separated on the Earth's surface. I think that the radio telescopes that they use about 7 radio telescopes. I think they were separated by as many as 13,000 kilometers. But in effect, you use these radio telescopes and the rotation of the Earth itself and extremely precise timing to act as though you have a mirror, if you will, if you can go back to my analogy with optics, that is that big. So the bigger...
So we're out of time, but I just have to say this. Some weeks we talk about gadgets, some weeks we talk about employment. Listeners, viewers, when you hear Glenn talk about this stuff, this is why he's executive editor of this magazine and I'm not. Because A, you clearly love it, and B, it is so wildly complex that I'm smiling and nodding, but mostly looking at the pictures and going, it's amazing to me. So thank you for taking us into outer space.
Happy to do it.
All right, we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Glenn.
Okay, take care.
So that was a great show. I think you've turned to me, by the way. I think I've gone from being a peer-to-peer, I don't know what, like skeptic. I think I was a skeptic, and I think based on your unbridled optimism, I'm thinking maybe. I didn't think of Uber the same way, which is interesting, but of course it is. It's all individuals that are
cautiously optimistic, which is good.
No. I think I'm more than cautiously optimistic. I mean, I like it. I like sharing as an economic driver, and if technology has made it safer and more transparent for everybody, then that's a good thing. And thank you for opening my eyes and removing some skepticism from my life.
Anytime.
We will be back next week with some other fabulous topic, which who knows what it will be, because this is going to be a frothy week, so it could be any one of a number of things. I think we're going to talk about Apple, among other things, next week.
Okay.
All right. Have a good week.
You too.